Hi there and welcome back for our next video on APUS history. Today we're going to be tackling the government policies during the Civil War. I am your APUSH with Lady Boss and I'm glad that you're joining me. If you want to scroll down below to the description, you'll be able to see some guided notes that you can download to follow along as you watch this video. So let's get started. We want to make sure that we are paying attention to the learning objective from the College Board. It says, explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted American ideals over the course of the war. So we're really going to be looking at how Lincoln and Union supporters shifted from preserving the Union to reframing that purpose of the war to actually obtaining freedom for African Americans or ending slavery. We also see important events like the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation being really significant moments during the Civil War. So we want to pay particular attention to those. So we're going to go through some brief historical context, address martial law, suspension of habeas corpus, conscription, the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address, and the election of 1864. So really looking at the political components of the Civil War here. So while historical context is extremely broad, the most significant historical context that I want to address here is the topic of the Copperheads. There was a group in the North especially called Peace Democrats, and they opposed the war because they believed it was unconstitutional and they did not believe the benefits were worth the cost. And so when we look at what government policies were instated in the Civil War, it's really important to just remember that there was this home front opposition that was going on, and that really determines a lot of the policies that Lincoln and Congress end up enacting during these times. So let's first look at martial law and the suspension of habeas corpus. Martial law is just the process that allows the military to take place of the civilian government. And so it's a lot more intense in the fact that the government and the military is connected. And through that process, Lincoln is going to suspend habeas corpus. Now, what is habeas corpus? It's what prevents the arrest of someone without evidence or warrant. So it can allow someone to be imprisoned just on more of the suspicion of a crime versus without having like a warrant that is based on evidence. Now, Chief Justice Taney is going to rule that Lincoln doesn't have the power to do so, but Lincoln disregards it. And then Congress ends up confirming this as well. And what ends up happening is there are about 10,000 subversives, people who are against the war, who end up being imprisoned without a trial. He further limits civil liberties by closing down some newspapers that were heavily criticizing the war effort. So those are some political actions that he took early in the war. Let's continue by looking at the Civil War Conscription Act, also known as the Enrollment Act. This is the first wartime draft in U.S. history. And so it required the registration of all male citizens ages 20 to 45. It also included immigrants who intended to become citizens. Now, there was one component to this Conscription Act that allowed for wealthy people to pay $300 to get out of the draft, or people could find a substitute for them. And so this war became known as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, highlighting the class issues that were happening as a result of this exemption clause. Additionally, as part of this Conscription Act, it led to riots in major cities. Some were so intense, like the one in New York City, that the Union Army had to come into these cities to put down the riots. So the Conscription Act was an important moment in wartime history that really demonstrates the intensity of the war, that there weren't enough volunteers. And as Lincoln was dealing with this home front opposition, he had to put in place this Conscription Act to get enough people to fight for the Union. Okay, next up, we're going to spend a bit more time here on the Emancipation Proclamation because of its importance and significance. So, historical context. We want to remember that Lincoln is fighting the Civil War because he wants to preserve the Union. However, many Northerners are pressuring Lincoln to do more, to not just preserve the Union, but to actually end slavery. However, if you remember, there are some border states that have slavery but have not seceded. And so Lincoln doesn't want to free or end slavery because then those border states might secede and provide an advantage to the Confederacy. But after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln believes he has enough momentum to kind of make a move here with the changing of the purpose of the war. So after Antietam, Lincoln is going to issue this preliminary emancipation. He basically says you need to surrender in 100 days or you will lose your slaves. And so no states in the Confederacy decide to take him up on his offer, but they continue to be in rebellion. And so on January 1st of 1863, this proclamation is put into effect. And I'll read you an excerpt from it next. But what we see happening as a result of this is that African Americans will flee to the Union lines. And one of the most significant things that happens as a result is the Confederacy will lose thousands of laborers, which further inhibits their ability to engage in the war. So here's a quotation from the Emancipation Proclamation. On the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. So what does it do? It actually frees very few slaves, right? Like he's only freeing states in the Confederacy. Well, how many people in the Confederacy view Lincoln as their president and are actually willing to free their slaves because of what Lincoln says? Right? Not many. So freeing of the slaves, the liberation actually happens as the Union Army travels through the South. So why did he only do this in the rebellious states? Why didn't he do it in the border states? Well, he didn't believe he had the constitutional power to do it. And so he used his military power as a temporary war measure. What would happen later is the passage of the 13th Amendment, where Congress actually has the power to do this. And also, Lincoln didn't want those border states to secede, so he allows slavery to continue there. So here's a couple reactions. Frederick Douglass says, "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree." On the opposite side, Ohio, a northern state, says the proclamation was monstrous, impudent, and heinous, insulting to God as to man. So not everyone in the North is in favor of this proclamation. But what is the significance? Emancipation now becomes a major part of the military strategy and goal. The purpose of the war has shifted from simply preserving to the Union to now ending slavery. It also allows for African Americans to fight in the Union Army, and we see about 200,000 African American soldiers join the Union Army, a total of 166 all-Black regiments with white officers participated in the war. Many other African Americans will labor in the Northern War effort. So various ways of supporting the war. Here is an image that would have been used to kind of to recruit African Americans to participate in the war effort. And we want to look at one of the most well-known regiments, the 54th Massachusetts. In fact, two of Frederick Douglass's sons joined this. They led a heroic attack on Fort Wagner. African Americans who were part of the Union Army faced great danger. Instead of being captured as a POW, they often would have been executed or returned to slavery. So here's an image of the actual 54th Massachusetts. Okay, moving on to our next significant government policy is really the Gettysburg Address. So remembering the Battle of Gettysburg, it's happening in July of 1863. It's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War with more than 50,000 casualties. As a result of this, Lee is never going to regain the offensive, but Lincoln is going to deliver this Gettysburg Address to dedicate the cemetery, and it ends up being one of the most famous and influential speeches in American history. Very short, delivered in 2 minutes, less than 275 words. So because it's so short and impactful, we are going to read the entire speech here. So I'm going to read the actual speech, but there is some language that can be difficult to understand, so feel free to follow along with the simplified. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So what is the significance? Lincoln here is redefining the war as a struggle for freedom and equality for all. He's inspiring the Union to continue to fight. Remember those Copperheads, those peace Democrats? They wanted to end the war. This is in November of 1863. The election of 1864 is coming up quickly, and there is a strong coalition of people that are trying to simply end the war. And so in this speech, while it was not a political speech, or intended to be a political campaign, I should say, it really was because it inspired the Union to continue the purpose of the war. Additionally, it poses a challenge for future generations to continue the hard work of ensuring that the nation lives up to its ideals set forward in our founding documents. Here is an image. Because Lincoln's speech was so short and unexpected, this is believed to be the only image from the Gettysburg Address. So, going on to this election of 1864, as I already mentioned, Lincoln's victory was far from certain. Reasons for that included the war had lasted significantly longer than people expected. Not everyone supported the Emancipation Proclamation. There was criticism over his wartime restraints of civil liberties and disapproval of the lenient plans that he had started to put in place for readmitting Confederate states. As late as August 23rd of 1864, he writes, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." So he's saying in the time between the election and the inauguration, we have to finish the war. We have to preserve the Union, because whoever is elected after is not going to do that. So in the election of 1864, Abraham Lincoln chooses Andrew Johnson as his running mate. Andrew Johnson is a Democrat, but he's a pro-war Democrat, and he's hoping that this will appeal to other pro-war Democrats. And while that is significant for the election, when we get to Reconstruction, you're going to understand how impactful and how negatively impactful this was on the United States after the war ends, after Lincoln's assassination. Additionally, they believed the war must be won at all costs and believed in freedom for enslaved persons. On the other side of the ticket, we see George McClellan and George Pendleton, supported by those Copperheads, believing that the South should be allowed to secede to save American lives, which would mean that slavery would continue. If you're recognizing this name, George McClellan, it's because he was one of the Union generals. So, interesting that one of the former Union generals believes that the war should not continue. So what we see here is a political cartoon. What you see is Lincoln on one side, Jefferson Davis on the other, and George McClellan in the middle. Lincoln is saying, "No peace without abolition." George McClellan, "The Union must be preserved at all hazards." And Jefferson Davis, "No peace without separation." And so kind of showing that McClellan is a bit of a middleman there. So what happens in this election? Well, electorally, not even close, right? Lincoln just obliterates McClellan in the electoral vote. Popular vote is a bit closer, but what we can think about is how Lincoln's leadership throughout the war, inspiring the North, really was significant in ensuring that the war ended with the South coming back into the Union. So here's a review of your learning objective. Explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted American ideals over the course of the war. I hope this video was helpful for you in understanding these government policies. If so, please like and subscribe.